Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. The brisk tapping of Holmes's cane on the front door of my humble Kensington apartments woke me up from an early supper in the second week of June, 1892, if memory serves me well. I hadn't seen much of my old friend since his return from a protracted engagement in the north of Yorkshire, and his telegram that morning simply read, "Urgent and sensitive subject. Prepare to travel. Yours, S.H." He strode inside with the same lean and hawkish demeanor I recalled, his grey eyes gleaming with the unmistakable glimmer from a case. The summer heat had left most Londoners sluggish, but Holmes' energy pierced the air like a whip. "Pack a valise, Watson," he said quickly, moving past me to the parlour. "We're taking the morning train to Bedfordshire. There's a mystery hidden within the parish of St. Luke's, and the local vicar is over himself." I was already wearing my boots. "A murder?" "No," Holmes said, his tone frustratingly neutral. "A vanishing. Her very inconvenient one. For the groom, his family, and the wedding guests. A bride has disappeared, Watson. She vanished in her bridal gown minutes before the ceremony, leaving no letter or trace." I blinked. "An elopement?" Holmes lifted his finger. "Elopement is a matter of passion. This case lacks such warmth. Let me brief you." Once seated by the fire, Holmes pulled a letter from his coat pocket, its creamy stock sporting the faded crest of a rural manor. "It arrived 2 days ago," he explained. "From Colonel Harrington, a retired military man stiff as a ramrod and mortified by scandal. Miss Emily Harrington, his daughter, was slated to marry Mr. Edwin Pritchard last Saturday. The guests had assembled, the bells were about to sound, and the church was adorned with lilies and lace. Yet when the hour came, Miss Harrington was nowhere to be found. No carriage tracks." I asked. "No witnesses?" "None. According to the household, she was spotted in her dressing room a half-hour previously, interacting with her maid. 10 minutes later, the maid returned with her veil to find the room vacant. The window is open. There are no tracks in the garden below. The grounds were searched, the surrounding stream was dredged, and the police from Bedford summoned." "And their findings?" Holmes smiled imperturbably. "Bedford's finest described it as a nervous flight. They believe the girl had a crisis of faith and fled into the woods. And yet, Watson, would a young girl abandon her entire family, a reputable match, and a collected assembly of nearly 200 people without even her cloak?" "Not if she were of sound mind," I answered. "Which I take it Miss Harrington is?" Holmes nodded. "By all accounts, brilliant, graceful, and devoted. There is no girlfriend, no debt, and no rumors of scandal. Colonel Harrington believes she had no reason to depart." I stirred the tea. "But then what should we assume? Kidnapping? Foul play?" Holmes leaned forwards. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must decide. What makes this case particularly interesting is not only the disappearance, but also the remarkable lack of motive. The girl had affluence, comfort, and admiration, none of the typical fissures that lead to such disasters." He hesitated, steepling his fingertips. "I suspect, Watson, that Miss Emily Harrington did not leave that chamber alone. I believe she was removed." I straightened in my chair. "By whom? That too we will uncover. The Colonel has requested discretion. We must arrive at lunchtime. The church, the house, the village, all are waiting, and somewhere amid them, I am persuaded, is a peaceful lie waiting to be disturbed." By the next morning, Holmes and I had boarded the 8:10 to Bedford, the countryside a blur beyond our compartment window. He sat cross-legged in meditation, eyes half closed. As I looked over the brief notes he'd scrawled in his pocketbook, name Emily Harrington, age 23, status, only daughter of Colonel Jonathan Harrington, fiancé, Mr. Edwin Pritchard, solicitor 31 London. Wedding is scheduled for June 10th at St. Luke's Parish. Disappearance between 11:20 and 11:40 a.m. from her dressing room in Harrington Hall. As the Bedford Junction whistle blew, Holmes finally awakened. "Watson," he replied quietly, "do not bother yourself with the obvious questions. Our mission is to look where others haven't. If a young woman disappears from a closed house in broad daylight, With no one witnessing her departure, we must wonder what else in that house is not as it appears. We dismounted off the train into warm, perfumed air and an almost vacant station, save for a tall, rigid man with a military moustache scrutinizing the crowd. He caught sight of us and moved forward. "Mr. Holmes," he said with reserved urgency, "I'm Colonel Jonathan Harrington." "Thank God you came." Holmes tilted his head. "Colonel, this is my associate, Dr. Watson." "Gentlemen," the colonel announced, "my daughter is gone. My house is being scrutinized, and unless we can answer this terrible conundrum swiftly, I worry the press will soon do it for us." Holmes's lips curled slightly. "Then let us begin where all brides do. Colonel, with the dressing room." And with that we hopped into the waiting carriage, unconscious that beneath the calm green of Bedfordshire's summer fields, a secret lay coiled, waiting to be unknotted by the finest intellect in London. The route from Bedford Station to Harrington Hall meandered softly past meadows blushing with June bloom, but the colonel's demeanour was cold as he sat rigidly opposite us in the carriage. Holmes watched him passively for a few minutes, allowing the cacophony of the wheels and hooves to drown his thoughts. Then finally Holmes spoke, his voice a gentle thread across the morning air. "Tell me, Colonel, what happened leading up to your daughter's disappearance? Spare no detail, no matter how insignificant it appears." The colonel's jaw twitched. "Very good. If you can believe it, it was sunny this morning. The air was as still as glass. Emily had remained calm, even smiling. My sister, her aunt, Mrs. Dalrymple, was assisting her with her dress. Nora, the maid, was in and out fetching items. At 11 o'clock I went to my study to welcome the vicar. I was gone for about 15 minutes. When I returned to the parlour, the house was in disorder. Nora was sobbing, my sister was yelling for the maids, and Emily was gone. Just gone." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Was the door to her dressing room locked?" "No, it was ajar, and the window open. Despite the fact that there were no prints in the garden, it appeared to be an invitation to flee. There's nothing to suggest she leapt or was taken. Was there anything missing? Clothes, personal items, or money?" "Nothing but the girl herself." He looked down and spoke in a harsh voice. "And the veil. The maid insists she left it on the side table. When she came back, it was gone." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Interesting detail. What about the fiancé, Mr. Pritchard?" The colonel's moustache twitched. "Distraught. He has remained close at the small inn. I cannot criticize his commitment, but I also cannot completely absolve him in my mind. Something, I don't know. Something about this whole affair feels off." Holmes nodded slowly, then turned to look out the window as the trees thinned, and Harrington Hall's grey chimneys loomed above the hedges. The house itself was made of Tudor bone, angular, ivy-laced, proud of its age, and with serene symmetry. However, there was a sense of unease, as if the walls themselves were in mourning. A footman greeted us at the carriage steps and led us into a grand, wood-panelled foyer with the faint scent of old roses and varnish. A woman dressed in widow's black appeared from the sitting room to greet us. "This is my sister, Mrs. Dalrymple," the colonel explained curtly. "She's been staying with us for the past month." Holmes extended his hand in a friendly manner. "Madam, can I ask when you last saw your niece?" Mrs. Dalrymple, a woman with sharp bones and sharper eyes, nodded tightly. "I left her at 11:30. She was calm, almost radiant. Nora and I had just finished the final pinning of her train. I kissed her face and went to check on the flowers on the altar. When I returned 10 minutes later, the girl had left, as though plucked out of the very air." Holmes inclined his head. "Was the room in disarray? Is there any sign of struggle?" "No, her bouquet remained. Her slippers were by the fireplace. But no veil. And no Emily." He said nothing, but his glance at me was crucial. We followed Colonel and Mrs. Dalrymple up a broad staircase, along an oak corridor softened by carpets, and into the dressing room. It was a lovely chamber, high-ceilinged, with a four-poster bed, a carved walnut dressing table, and a great casement window flung wide over a bordered rose garden. Sunlight seeped in, lighting dust motes and creating a warm glow on the parquet floor. Holmes moved silently across the room, hands behind his back, eyes flickering from object to object with surgical accuracy. He paused by the dressing table, which had a silver-backed brushes, a bottle of lavender water, and a delicate ivory fan. Then go to the side table beside the window. A porcelain vase with fresh lilies, a little Bible, A lace handkerchief and nothing else. Nothing has been moved? Holmes asked. Not since she vanished, the Colonel confirmed. We've kept it exactly as it was. Holmes knelt to examine the floor near the window. He pushed his hand against the windowsill and leaned out to view the drop below, about 15 feet down to a bed of loam and grass. No signs of scuffing or broken foliage, he mumbled. If she climbed out, she did so like a ghost. He then focused his attention on the closet, opening the doors and peering inside. Rows of neatly draped gowns, shoes organized by color. Holmes's long fingers reached toward the back wall and lightly tapped. Solid, he mumbled. No false panel, I spoke, breaking the long pause. Holmes, isn't it possible she was duped? Perhaps a letter or a message was delivered. Holmes didn't respond. He was crouched down, his gaze level with the skirting board beneath the bed. He reached forward and paused. Colonel, he asked quietly, was your daughter in the habit of writing letters in this room? The Colonel seemed surprised. Yes, absolutely. She frequently corresponded with cousins in Yorkshire. Then where is her stationery box? We all turned and looked. The writing desk featured a lamp, a blotter, a pen and an inkwell, but no paper, envelopes or box. Mrs. Dalrymple moved forward, her face furrowed. That's unusual. It was always here. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. The removal of such a personal item implies intention. Either she took it to write a letter, or someone removed it to prevent us from seeing one. He turned back to the window. Watson, fetch me your walking stick. Puzzled, I handed it to him, and he stretched it toward the rose trellis outside the window, testing its strength. The wood creaked faintly. Not sturdy enough to bear a woman's full weight, he decided. But perhaps just enough to guide a veil downward. The Colonel stiffened. Are you asking that someone remove it from the window? Lowered it as a signal. Holmes grinned slightly. I have no suggestions yet. However, we must go to the church next. There's always something to learn at the altar. Within an hour, we were going up the village lane toward the parish of St. Luke's, a little stone building hidden behind a moss-covered wall. The vicar, a red-cheeked guy wearing spectacles, greeted us at the gate with profuse apologies. Mr. Holmes, I've never seen such uncertainty. The poor girl disappeared like smoke. We searched the pews, vestry, and bell tower. I don't suppose, Holmes gently interrupted, that you have a copy of the wedding register from that morning. Of course. The vicar retrieved it from a folder. Holmes flipped through the pages until he came across the June 10th entry. Emily Harrington's name was next to Mr. Edwin Pritchard's, written in a precise, attractive style. Holmes looked at it for a long time. Curious, he whispered. She signed it in advance, the vicar frowned. Yes, she asked to do so on Friday, just in case nerves made her hands tremble on the day. Holmes nodded and then pointed. And this is beneath her name. Do you recognize this? A thin writing in pale pen, almost imperceptible. 2 initials NH, no, the vicar admits. I never noticed it before. Holmes closed the book and gave it back. Let's pay a visit to Mr. Pritchard. I suspect the future husband may know far more than he has stated. He turned, his coat trailing after him like a shadow. I followed, my thoughts racing. The bride was gone, the veil was missing, the stationery had vanished, and now there were enigmatic initials on a sacred page. Holmes hadn't shared his theory yet, but I could feel it building behind his eyes like a storm about to break. The mystery of a bride's disappearance on her wedding day remains unanswered. Why did she take the veil but not the bouquet? The small inn, the Dog and Crown, sat quietly on the edge of the green, its worn sign creaking in the early afternoon breeze. A wisteria vine clung firmly to the gables, and a border of lavender softened the stone path that led to the front door. Holmes and I entered the chilly shade of the door, where a kid around 14 swiftly vanished behind the counter to summon Mr. Edwin Pritchard. Holmes stood in the center of the common area, contemplating the paintings over the hearth, as if they were whispering a secret, while I took in the surroundings. The inn was clean and unassuming, with dark oak beams and the lingering fragrance of coal smoke from the morning's fire. Footsteps on the staircase directed our attention to the man descending. Pritchard was of medium build, trim and well-dressed for the countryside. His collar was crisp and his cravat knotted precisely. But the pallor on his cheeks and rigidity in his stride revealed the pressure he was enduring. He extended a hand without confidence. Hi, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I trust the Colonel has explained my situation. Holmes did not shake the outstretched hand. He simply looked at the man with the type of calm scrutiny that made even the most innocent feel exposed. "He has told me the facts as he knows them," Holmes remarked finally. "But I prefer to hear things for myself." "Can we sit?" Pritchard indicated to a side parlour, and we followed him into a room with flowered draperies and a writing desk near the window. A sheaf of correspondence lay open next to an untouched cup of tea. He sat heavily in a wing-back chair, his hands clasped together. "I hardly know what to say," he began. "One moment I was preparing to walk down the aisle with the woman I adored, and the next I was standing alone before 100 guests, wondering if I'd been made a fool or lost her forever." Holmes leaned against the mantelpiece. Were there any signs in the days leading up to the wedding that Miss Harrington was hesitant? Pritchard shook his head at once. None. Emily looked glowing and excited. She often mentioned our plans and our future in London. There was no reason for concern, no disagreements, and no secrets between us. "People often keep their secrets well," Holmes remarked dryly. "What of your relationship with the Colonel?" Pritchard paused, formal but cordial. He disapproved at first, thought I was beneath her. "But I have respectable means. I studied law at Oxford. He eventually warmed up to me." Holmes gave a quick glance at the desk. "You've been writing letters?" Pritchard followed his eyes. "Only inquiries with the local police and a letter to my uncle in Surrey. He's quite fond of Emily and upset by the news." Holmes took up the topmost page and read a line aloud. "There is still no word from her. I can't believe she would do this to me without reason." He put it back down. "Do you believe she left of her own will?" "I don't know what to believe," Pritchard stated, his voice rising. "If she got cold feet, why not say it? Why not run the day before? Why wait until the last minute, completely clothed, and disappear like a vanishing act?" "Did you see her that morning?" "Yes, briefly, approximately 10. I brought her a tiny box containing an antique family brooch. She seemed moved by it." "A brooch?" Pritchard nodded. "Emeralds and gold, Edwardian. It belonged to my mother." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "And where is this brooch now?" I do not know. I assumed she was wearing it. She didn't. It was not located in her room. Either she never wore it, or someone took it after she vanished." The hush in the room deepened. Pritchard was genuinely surprised by the suggestion. "Do you suspect theft?" "I suspect very little," Holmes remarked calmly. "But I notice contradictions. The veil is missing. The brooch is missing. The stationery box is missing. All of the objects were little, easy to conceal, and perhaps easier to carry away when one is trying not to be noticed." Pritchard furrowed his brow. "Do you think she took them, or did someone else do it?" Holmes did not respond directly. "Were there any guests at the wedding whose presence was unexpected?" "Only my cousin, Ned Harford. He returned from India only last week. I did not expect him to arrive on time. But he sent a wire Friday evening." Holmes's expression flickered. "Harford, N.H." Pritchard blinked. "Yes, those are his initials." Holmes straightened. "Where is he now?" "He left the morning after. Said he had business in Liverpool." "Why?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because it seems, Mr. Pritchard, that your cousin left a small footprint behind in the wedding register. It's time we paid Ned Harford a visit." Outside, as we returned to the lane, I couldn't contain my growing unease. "You think this Harford had something to do with Emily's disappearance?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "that Mr. Harford may be the first thread in a very careful knot. Why sign the register with his initials? Why leave so abruptly the next day? Why bring himself uninvited to a wedding where, it now seems, several small objects and one very large one, namely the bride, disappeared?" We returned to Harrington Hall and requested the Colonel's permission to view the guest list. Holmes pored over it with a strange intensity, his finger trailing down the names. "Here, Ned Harford, guest of the groom. No address listed. Curious, most guests have their residence noted." The Colonel frowned. "He arrived unannounced. Edwin vouched for him." Holmes tapped the page. "And here one name is struck out. Who is Miss Clara D?" The Colonel looked, then grunted. "Clara Dalrymple. My sister's daughter. She declined at the last minute due to illness." Holmes glanced up. "Did she often correspond with Emily?" "They were close. Wrote weekly, I believe." "And was her letter of declination kept?" Mrs. Dalrymple, who had just entered the room with a tray of tea, overheard and answered. "I placed it in Emily's stationery box," she said, "along with some other things she wanted to keep, old letters, cards." Holmes arched his brow. So it was there the night before. Yes, without a doubt. Then its absence becomes all the more significant. The pieces were forming, albeit faintly. We had a visitor, whose initials matched the strange mark in the register. A brooch given and then vanished. A veil gone. A box of personal letters removed. And now a cousin who declined to attend, but whose communication was among the missing objects. Holmes paced to the window. "Watson," he said, "do you recall what I said about looking where others have not?" "Yes. You said we must question what in the house is not what it seems." He turned, eyes glittering. "Indeed. And now we must ask, what in this house has not been searched because it was presumed to be untouched? We must go back to the dressing room. There is a piece still missing. One more absence I had not accounted for." We followed him once more through the silent corridors. The room was just as we had left it. Holmes crossed to the closet and threw it open again. "This wardrobe. It is deeper than it appears. The back panel is slightly bowed." He pressed his palm against it. There was a hollow knock. With sudden, precise movement, Holmes reached behind the lowest row of gowns and gave a sharp tug at a brass hook near the seam. The panel gave way with a soft click. Inside was a narrow compartment, no more than a foot wide, but within, carefully folded, was a long, white veil, and beneath it, a brooch of emerald and gold. Holmes did not speak at first. He held the items in his hands, as though weighing the story they told. Then he turned to me. "Watson, she did not run away. She hid something here. She wanted it found, but only by the right person." I stared. "Then where is she now?" Holmes gave a slow, almost reluctant breath. "That, I believe, depends on whether Ned Harford left alone, or whether someone else left with him, dressed in mourning black instead of bridal white." And with that, the storm behind Holmes's eyes began to break. Holmes did not linger once the hidden veil and brooch were recovered. He wrapped both carefully in his handkerchief and tucked them into his inner coat pocket. There was no triumph in his manner, no glimmer of satisfaction, only that sharpened silence I had come to recognize when his mind had moved from discovery to deduction and was already galloping toward the next turn in the path. "Watson," he whispered barely above a whisper, "we're looking for a plan, not just a disappearance, one precise enough to incorporate misdirection and misbelief into its design." I looked at the small nook, which was now empty save for a faint mark in the dust where the veil had rested. She hid the brooch. That demonstrates intent, not terror, indeed. More than that, timing. If she had been abducted by force, she would not have been able to conceal these goods, no. She experienced a moment of serenity. Maybe only a few minutes. That moment reveals everything. We were interrupted by a soft knock from a servant advertising tea below. Holmes sent him out with a quick thank you and turned to me when we were alone again. She removes her veil and brooch. "Why those two items, Watson? Why not the slippers, the flowers, or a token letter?" The answer lies in the contradiction. These are the two items she should have grabbed if she were merely walking away from the altar. But instead she concealed them. It's more than just a statement. It's a rejection of the narrative. "You mean she wanted someone to know she hadn't run away?" "Precisely. These things were intended to be discovered, but only when it was too late to follow. Then why not leave a note?" I asked. Holmes's face darkened slightly. "Because a note may be fabricated or intercepted. A veiled veil and a misplaced brooch are facts." She carefully selected her symbols. "And Ned Harford?" I pressed. "You suspect he helped her?" Holmes appeared thoughtful. "Perhaps. But I'm wondering if his leaving was as voluntary as we imagined. Consider, Watson, if someone wanted to leave a place unobserved, wouldn't they be better off leaving in the shadow of someone who is supposed to travel? You think someone else may have left disguised as him?" "I believe," Holmes responded, "that Ned Harford's name is being utilized. I'm not sure whether he's doing it alone or with someone else." We returned to the Colonel's study, where the fire had been lit despite the warm weather outside and the heavy curtains drawn. The Colonel looked up as we entered, his expression tired. "Well, more riddles or any solutions?" "We found the veil," Holmes said, taking the handkerchief bundle and gently placing it on the desk. "And the missing brooch." The Colonel rose abruptly. "Where?" "In a concealed compartment behind the wardrobe in your daughter's dressing room." The man turned pale. "Then she was there." "She did not run." "No," Holmes replied gently. But she also did not intend to be found quickly. The colonel ran a shaky hand through his silver hair. Who could have helped her do such a thing? Possibly someone already familiar to the household, Holmes implied. Someone who could slip through the wedding crowd unnoticed. Colonel, did your niece Clara Dalrymple genuinely become unwell on the morning of the ceremony? Mrs. Dalrymple, who had come behind us and heard the end of the inquiry, spoke hurriedly. She wired us that she had taken fever and could not travel from Tunbridge Wells. Do you still have the telegram? Holmes asked. No, Emily must have discarded it. I never thought about keeping it. Holmes gave the faintest nod. It would be most helpful if you could wire her now. Request that she confirm the nature of her ailment and when it began. Mrs. Dalrymple was perplexed and replied, Yes, of course. But what are you implying? I don't imply anything, madam. I prefer questions over implications. For now. An hour later, we boarded another train, this time heading west toward Liverpool rather than north. Holmes had located the hotel where Ned Harford had purportedly booked a room. A wire from the concierge confirmed that a man matching his description had arrived, but had not returned by the evening of the 10th. The train's pace calmed my anxiety sufficiently to allow me to reflect. Forgive me, Holmes, but I can't see the arc of this. Emily had plenty of opportunities to discreetly leave the wedding. Why is there so much theatre? Why vanish on the day dressed in her gown? Because, Holmes explained without lifting his eyes, the impact mattered. Her absence had to imply something, not just to avoid marriage, but to convey a message to someone. To whom? Holmes opened his eyes and they were almost sorrowful. That, Watson, is what I fear we may uncover too late. After arriving in Liverpool, Holmes wasted no time. We proceeded straight to the hotel mentioned on the registry. A young man at the front desk confirmed that Mr. Ned Harford had slept there for one night. He had checked in under his own name, left no forwarding address, and paid with cash. Did he leave alone? Holmes asked. The clerk paused. He arrived with a lady, sir. Elderly, wearing a thick black veil. We believed she was his aunt. She never left the room. Did you see her face? No, sir. Did they take the morning train? Actually, no. They went in a hired carriage about daybreak. The porter took note of the time. Holmes's expression clouded. This is a hired carriage. That leaves us with little to trace. We stood once more in Liverpool streets, the salt air from the docks clinging to the breeze, and Holmes's face set in iron lines. She was here, he mumbled. He brought her here, or someone did. Veiled and nameless, a ruse designed to fade in silence rather than evaporate in chaos. I followed his eyes down to the distant masts of the ships. You think she's gone abroad? I imagine, Holmes answered slowly. She has made herself a passenger in someone else's story. The question is, did she do it willingly? We returned to the telegraph office, where Holmes quickly composed 3 dispatches, one to Scotland Yard, another to a shipping agent he knew in Southampton, and the third, to my surprise, to the Colonel himself. Do you expect the Colonel to act? No, I anticipate him to react, and that is the reaction I am most interested in. By the time we checked into our rooms for the night, Holmes had been quiet, seated beside the window, his gaze fixated on the starry bay. He didn't speak again until I was about to fall asleep. Watson, think back to the veil. What about it? It was poorly hidden. Her child could have discovered it. She wanted it discovered, yes, but the timing of the discovery would matter. She couldn't know who would find it. She either trusted someone to return to the room or expected everyone would eventually do so. I sat upright. You think it was a message to someone specific? Holmes nodded. Or a warning. If she suspected danger, not simply remorse or an unwanted marriage, she would go to great lengths to disappear without leaving a trace that could bring her captor back to her. You suspect Pritchard? No, Holmes said after a time, but I no longer believe his innocence to be absolute. I trust only the logic of her silence. Just then, a boy from the front desk knocked. A telegram had arrived from Mrs. Dalrymple. Holmes read it aloud. Clara says she has no illness. Never sent telegram. I did not write to Emily since May. Perplexed and worried. Stop. He breathed slowly. Then he smiled. Okay, Watson. That somewhat loosens the final knot. What does it mean? It means, Holmes replied, standing, That someone fabricated that telegraph to clear Clara of suspicion. But why? Unless she was present in some form. I stared at him. You believe Clara Dalrymple was at the wedding? I think someone posed as her, perhaps to slip through the house unnoticed, perhaps to guide Emily out, and if that's true, then the stage is set. The curtain rises on the next act tomorrow morning, back in London. For if Emily Harrington still walks this country under another name, Watson, we must find her before someone else does. We got back to London before noon the next day. The train carriage was silent, except for the delicate rustling of Holmes's notes and the repetitive clatter of wheels on tracks. I had learnt not to interrupt him during these periods of solitude, when thinking completely overtook him. His gaze remained fixed on a distant point beyond the window, and I doubt he observed anything of the passing countryside. He did not speak till we were approaching Paddington Station. Watson, we need to make 3 stops before sunset. First, the Great Eastern Shipping Company's offices are near the docks, then to a certain theatrical costumier off Drury Lane. Finally, visit a flower shop in Bloomsbury. I looked up, surprised. A flower shop? Holmes grinned slightly. Indeed. Watson, it's the little things, the daily things, that betray extraordinary designs. And this case, I suppose, is about the quiet manipulation of the commonplace. We disembarked, rented a cab, and arrived at the shipping company's tiny, grey-fronted premises. Holmes delivered his card with quick authority. Within minutes, we were directed to a clerk who confirmed that numerous outbound vessels had left Liverpool 2 days prior, 2 bound for Canada, 1 for Lisbon, and another for Cape Town. Holmes leaned in. Did any of those ships log a Miss Clara Dalrymple among their passengers? The man grimaced and grabbed a logbook closer to him, looking over the carefully written pages. No Clara Dalrymple, sir, he responded after a time. But wait, there's a Miss Carlotta Denham, boarded the Calliope for Halifax. I am 23. She was accompanied by Mr. Edward H. Merriweather, who was named as her uncle. Holmes' face did not respond, but I noticed the pulse at his temple quiver. I'd be most obliged if you could show me their signatures. The clerk pulled out a backup book, and Holmes examined the flourishing names. Well, he replied softly, we've found our veil again, Watson. The penmanship matches that of the wedding register. She is still writing in disguise. As we stepped back out into the bustle of dock activity, I slumped beside Holmes, concerned. She's gone to Canada, then. Or someone wants us to believe she has, Holmes answered. But consider this. Miss Harrington had ample opportunity to flee openly. The shipping record was filed with the proper papers and signatures. That suggests forethought. However, no one with that name was ever announced to the visitors or family. Why create an alias that is so easily checked? Unless she wanted to get it checked. Hey, breadcrumb, Watson. So where do we follow it? Back to London's stage. The costumier on Drury Lane greeted Holmes with polite surprise and even deference, an old acquaintance, it appeared, from a previous case. The shop smelled like camphor and dusted velvets, and garment racks lined the small hall like soldiers waiting for inspection. Holmes presented the man a folded sketch of Emily Harrington's face, which was made from memory and softly shaded. Has this young woman visited your establishment within the past 2 weeks? The costumier squinted and nodded slowly. Yes, sir, last Tuesday. She arrived with another lady, older with a slight stoop and a black veil. They stayed to themselves and inquired about mourning garments and old-fashioned bonnets. The younger woman bought a plain black gown and a brown travel cloak. Paid with cash. Did she give a name? No, sir, but she had a Yorkshire accent, which I assume wasn't genuine. Holmes's eyes glittered. How so? Too broad. Nearly completed. Like a girl playing charwoman for a parlour joke. Outside, Holmes paused in the sun and exhaled. The pattern holds. She is purposely creating false trails, disguises, misdirection. And now, Watson, to Bloomsbury. The flower shop was a tiny space sandwiched between a bookstore and a tailor's. Its windows were adorned with wilted carnations and bright sunflowers. As we walked in, a woman wearing an apron dusted petals off the counter. Holmes's tone was friendly yet firm. You delivered lilies and white roses to Harrington Hall last Friday for a wedding, did you not? The florist nodded. Yes, sir, large order. 4 dozen lilies, 3 white roses, and a cascade bouquet. I'd like to know if any other orders were made by the same client in the days prior. She touched her ledger and turned back a few pages. Yes, there was one. A single bouquet of violets delivered to the same address. It is Tuesday morning. Violets, Holmes reiterated. To the same name? No, sir, that order came from a Miss Violet Clay. Unfamiliar handwriting. Paid in advance. He turned to me once we were outside again. The simplest things, flowers, names, signatures. She is weaving a net of false identity, Watson, but it is a net of her own choosing. She is not fleeing danger. She is moving towards something. The question now is what lies at the center of her maze. Back at Baker Street, Holmes retired to his armchair without a word. I poured the tea and waited as the room darkened, the lamps catching the dust in the air like motes of golden mist. He sat unmoving, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally he spoke. Let us review. A bride disappears moments before her wedding. No note, no trail. A brooch and veil are hidden. Her supposed cousin vanishes the next morning. A false telegram is sent in her actual cousin's name. A ship logs her as a veiled woman under a pseudonym, but the trail is almost too neat. And all the while she leaves crumbs. A forged accent. A bouquet under a false name. Why? Because she wants someone to follow her? I offered, perhaps. But I now think she wants only one person to follow her. Not the police. Not her father. Not even her fiancé. Then who? Holmes didn't answer at once. He reached into his coat and withdrew the veil, unfolding it delicately on the table. He ran his fingers along the edge, then paused, drew out a magnifying lens and examined the hem. Ah, he leaned closer. What is it? I asked, crossing the room. Holmes turned the veil so I could see a small embroidered initial nearly invisible. C, not E, for Emily. C for Clara. So she did pose as her cousin. Holmes nodded. But more than that. She sewed the signature into the veil she left behind. She wants someone to realize she's not who she appears to be. But she also wants to be that person. Think of what we've learned, Watson. She left her identity behind not simply to disappear, but to change shape. I stood back, struck by a sudden clarity. You believe she assumed Clara's identity fully? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that she staged her own disappearance in order to escape something far deeper than a wedding. Perhaps something we've not yet glimpsed. He stood then and paced the room. Tomorrow we visit the offices of Edwin Pritchard. His law offices? Yes. Something about him continues to trouble me. Too clean, too composed. What if the marriage wasn't the trap she escaped, but the result of a prior one? You think he knew? I think, Holmes murmured, that Miss Emily Harrington may have found something in his past, and instead of confronting it, she chose to vanish from it. He returned to his chair. I suspect the truth lies not in what she did, but in what she read. What she read? Holmes's smile was faint and knowing. Remember the missing stationery box? It held her letters. If she took it with her, then she's protecting correspondence. And that, Watson, means someone is afraid of what's inside. A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson stepped in with a telegram. Holmes read it, then handed it silently to me. Miss Violet Clay cited purchasing train ticket to York, accompanied by elderly woman, departed 4:05 p.m. Inspector Gregsoni looked up. She's still in England. Holmes reached for his coat. Then the game resumes in York. We are late, but not too late. He paused at the door. This is no longer just a case of disappearance, Watson. It is a case of rebirth. By dawn the next morning, we were aboard the express to York, the city still asleep beneath a pearl-grey sky. Holmes had said little since receiving the telegram, though his eyes, clear, sharp and unreadable, never once strayed from the countryside unfurling beyond the glass. His fingers rested on the arm of his seat, motionless save for a small habitual flexing, like a concert pianist playing a silent refrain. I waited until the train had passed Grantham before speaking. Holmes, if we do find her in York, what then? Do we confront her? Return her to her father? Inform Mr. Pritchard? No, he replied gently. We do none of those things, I blinked. Then why are we pursuing her? He turned to face me, the light catching the contours of his expression. Because she is in flight, Watson. Not from shame, but from entanglement. And if I'm correct, the final danger has not yet passed her. She has gone to ground in the only way she knows, by becoming someone else. We must find her not to interrupt her escape, but to understand it. We arrived in York just after 8. The city bustled gently with morning life, vendors arranging their stalls in the shambles, carts rattling over the cobblestones, and cathedral bells beginning their slow, noble peal. Holmes, moving at once with purpose, led us directly to the station master's office. A few minutes later, we were inspecting the registry of recent departures and arrivals. There, Holmes pointed. Miss Violet Clay. Arrived yesterday at 6:22 p.m. 2 tickets from King's Cross, paid in cash. No trunk, just 2 carpet bags, the station master nodded. They hired a cab, Holman's Stables. I believe they gave an address near Bootham Crescent. Holmes turned to me. Come, Watson. We'll walk. It was a brisk 10-minute journey along the edge of the Minster Gardens, and though Holmes made no comment, I could sense his attention sweeping every alley, every shadowed doorway, as if reading a set of footprints others could not see. We arrived at a modest boarding house of red brick facade, the curtains in the lower windows drawn, the brass nameplate dulled by age. Mrs. F. Granger, rooms let weekly. Holmes stepped inside, greeted the landlady with his customary courtesy, and presented his card. The woman, small and shrewd-eyed, gave a startled look at the name, Sherlock Holmes. Well now, I suppose this is about my new lodger? Holmes tilted his head. Miss Violet Clay? Yes, her and her aunt. Took the upstairs front room, quiet as mice. Paid a week in advance, no fuss. Have they gone out this morning? Just the elder one. Said she was going to the grocer. The young lady's still in? Holmes passed her a coin. May I trouble you for a brief word with her? It's of a sensitive nature. The landlady, now intrigued, nodded. Of course. Give me a moment. She disappeared upstairs, and we waited in the narrow hallway, the scent of coal soot mingling with polished banisters and freshly cut flowers on the sill. After a minute we heard soft footsteps descending. She appeared without ceremony, cloaked in grey, her hair pinned simply, no veil, no disguise. The face was unmistakably Emily Harrington's, thinner, perhaps paler, but calm and composed. Her eyes landed on Holmes, and she did not flinch. I thought it might be you, she said. Her voice was steady, even weary. You took longer than I expected. Holmes gave the faintest of bows. Miss Harrington, though I suppose that name no longer applies, I've come not to interfere but to understand. She studied him for a moment, then turned to me with a small, wry smile. And Dr. Watson. Goodness, I suppose you've recorded every twist of this ridiculous story. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. I've done my best to keep up, Miss Clara, she supplied softly. For now, at least. Holmes gestured toward the narrow parlour off the hall. Might we speak inside? She considered a moment, then nodded. Yes, but only for a few minutes. My train leaves at noon. The room was dim and modest. She sat by the window, hands folded, and Holmes stood before the fireplace as though delivering counsel in his own drawing room. I remained beside the door, unsure whether I was witness, guardian, or confessor. I'll be direct, Holmes said. You vanished with great care, leaving false trails, false names, and calculated silences. And yet you left a message, for someone, or perhaps anyone clever enough to find it. Why, she didn't answer at first. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the morning sun slanted through lace curtains. Because I needed a witness, she said at last. Not to my escape, but to why I escaped. Holmes inclined his head. Go on. I was never going to marry Edwin Pritchard, she confessed calmly. You already guessed that part. However, it was not a case of cold feet. It was not even dread. It was knowledge. Knowledge I gained too late. Holmes remained silent, his gaze fixated on her features. He was not, as he appeared, charming, respectful, and generous. All of that. But last month, by coincidence, I discovered a letter in his coat pocket, one intended for someone else, a woman in Birmingham. The handwriting was intimate. It mentioned debts, threats, and fake documents. He intended to marry me for my dowry, and use it to settle even darker issues than the law permitted. I confronted him in the gentlest way I could, asking about the letter and the woman. Her voice caught, but only slightly. He laughed. They told me to forget it. They called it a misunderstanding. However, his eyes have changed. I knew I'd seen the actual man behind the veil. I wrote to his solicitor inquiring about specific deeds. I received no response. Then I went to see a friend in London, an actress, a good one. She helped me devise the strategy. To disappear, Holmes said. To become someone else, she clarified. Someone without property, without obligations, without a name any man could leverage. She cast a glance at me then. Do you understand, Dr. Watson? I did not run from a man. I fled from a cage with velvet walls. Holmes moved closer. What happens now, Canada? A new life with Violet Clay? No, she replied, smiling slightly. That was a deception. I reserved a seat on the passenger list, but another woman boarded in mine. I sent her the cloak, veil, and sovereign purse. She'll arrive in Halifax and vanish into quiet obscurity. And you? I'll head to Scotland first. Then perhaps the continent. I haven't decided yet. I will instruct. Maybe right. I merely needed time to begin. The hush in the room felt almost reverent. Holmes replied, "Of course your father assumes you are dead or taken. That Mr. Pritchard will pretend grief and launch a campaign of heroic grieving." Her jaw stiffened. "I mourn nothing that lies behind me." Following a moment, she softly said, "But my father, I'll write him. On time, not now. Not while Edwin continues to circle like a hawk, waiting for the wind to alter." Holmes offered a tiny nod. "You've built your story well," he commented. "But one question remains." She raised her eyes to meet his. "Why leave the veil?" Her expression became slightly amused. "Because a successful illusion requires a last act." I left with my eyes wide, hoping that someone would understand. That I had not been abducted. Holmes stood back, satisfied. I opened my mouth to speak, but she rose gracefully and confidently. "You followed me far enough, gentlemen," she remarked. "Let me walk the rest alone." Holmes bent. "If ever you require assistance under any name, you know where I reside," she smiled. "You can see through everything, Mr. Holmes, but thank you for not ripping down all the curtains." With that, she turned and climbed the stairs, her footfalls smooth, unhurried, and certain. Holmes and I strolled back into the sunny street, the hum of city life flowering all around us. I turned to face him. "Will you inform the Colonel?" Holmes shakes his head. "No, not until she agrees to it. She is not a fugitive, Watson. She's an author, rewriting herself. And when we went back towards the station, I felt strangely lighter. Not every instance, I reasoned, resulted in justice or law. Some end in quietness, in peaceful reinvention. And Holmes, who was constantly chasing shadows, had this time helped one escape. We returned to London under a beautiful grey silk sky, the clouds moving slowly and deliberately, as if the weather had softened in the aftermath of the storm we had just passed through. Holmes sat peacefully for the most of the ride, not in one of his worst fugue episodes, but in reflective silence, a stillness not of brooding but of completion. There was, I knew, a peculiar peace in him, the kind that came only when the truth, however complex, had been softly released rather than seized. As the train approached Paddington, he moved and turned to face me. "She's safe, Watson. That at least we have achieved. It makes no difference whether the rest of the world knows about it." I nodded. "You don't believe she'll contact her family soon?" "Eventually, when she is no longer pursued by the law or by the past, her father will hear from her, but not in the way he expected. I suppose Miss Harrington, or Clara as she now calls herself, wishes to live free of the burden of responsibility or inheritance. And I, for one, will not be the one to return her to the cage." We arrived at Baker Street at lunchtime. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a kind nod and the pleasant smells of fresh bread. Before I could remove my coat, a telegram was waiting on the mantel. Holmes lifted it with one eyebrow raised. He read it twice silently. Then he handed it to me. "To Sherlock Holmes. Stop Pritchard. Was found dead in flat. Poison is suspected. No signs of forced entry. Police at a loss. Request immediate assistance." "Gregson, stop." I felt the breath catch in my chest. "Dead, but when?" "Likely this morning," Holmes replied, already moving to retrieve his coat. "Poison. No forced entrance. And a man left in the middle of a disappearing act." We arrived at Pritchard's London flat, a lovely second-floor pad in Gray's Inn, around 1:30. The situation was already fully under control. Constable Bradshaw guarded the entrance, while Inspector Gregson waited inside, his mustache bristling with restrained anxiety. Thank the heavens. "Holmes?" Gregson murmured as he ushered us inside immediately. "It's a terrible mess. Pritchard was discovered just 2 hours ago by his housekeeping. She arrived late. He hadn't called for breakfast. Found him at his writing desk, slumped forward, teacup at his elbow and untouched toast." Holmes entered the study without saying a word. The body stayed where it had fallen, face forward, jaw limp, eyes open in a glassy look. The skin had taken on a faint greyish hue around the mouth and throat. A lone cup of tea rested on the desk. The surface beside it showed no traces of effort, simply order, calm, and silence. Holmes crouched, sniffed the rim of the teacup, and studied the porcelain through his lens. No scent, he mumbled. But the residue is chalky. Arsenic, I believe. Watson! I leaned down beside him and examined the mouth. Yes, the distinctive tightness, and the rage indicates that he died between 7 and 9 a.m. Gregson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. No broken locks. There is no disturbance. No one spotted entering or leaving. Holmes stood slowly. Then he knew who had killed him. Or let them in freely. Gregson frowned. You don't think it was suicide? No, Holmes replied bluntly. A man determined to erase his own past does not keep his accounts balanced, his records filed, or his boots polished. This marked the conclusion of someone else's scheme. He started pacing the room. Consider this, Gregson. A woman disappears on her wedding day. Her fiancé displays little concern, keeps his cool, and gives well-chosen details. And now, when she has escaped every eye and vanished into a built new life, he dies silently, neatly, conveniently. You think she did it? No, Holmes replied, his voice softening. I believe she arranged it. Or more specifically, organized for the appropriate parts to fall where they may. He turned toward the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside, the papers were beautifully organized. Client letters, contracts, and a single bound folio labeled private. Holmes flicked it open, studied the pages, and then stopped. He held up a sheet for us to view. It was a handwritten confession, unfinished. To anyone it may concern, I hereby admit that I fabricated the deed to the Sutton property, falsified the transfer signatures, and used Miss Harrington's family name to acquire loans from several lenders under false pretenses. I did not aim to cause harm, but the circumstances, the sentence ended. He was going to confess, I explained. No, Holmes responded. I was forced to confess, or more accurately, persuaded to believe he must. This is not remorse, Watson. It's a panic-driven estimate. He turned to face Gregson. Did anyone visit this flat this morning? Just the housekeeping. Arrived at 9:30. There are no traces of intrusion. Servants? Holmes inquired. Nobody stays overnight. Last evening he dined alone. Had a bottle of claret. No visitors were reported. Holmes inspected the window latches. There are no signs here either. But take note of this. The doorframe varnish. Slightly nicked. Someone used a master key or carefully picked the lock. Not forcefully, but skillfully. Gregson frowned. Then we have a professional, perhaps, Holmes replied. Or someone who has a reason to remain quiet. Someone who knew exactly where the poison would be. Someone with a light enough hand to mix it with tea. While the man went for his pen, he returned to the desk, opened the side drawer, and produced a photograph of Emily Harrington. Sat opposite Pritchard, both smiling stiffly. Watson, he replied, if Emily discovered the truth about his scam, as he suspected, then this morning's death was not murder. Failed was containment. You think she sent someone? I believe someone decided to intervene on her behalf. Perhaps she confided in someone with a motive. Gregson looked up. Ned Harford? Holmes' expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes flashed. No, Harford never returned to London. Remember Clara's buddy, the actress who helped build the escape? An actor who specializes in voices, disguises, and poison bottles labeled as prop spirits. That woman no one would suspect in a morning gown and gloves. We stood still as the parts fell into place. She eliminated the danger before he could retaliate, I told him. No, Holmes said. She offered him a choice. I believe he drank the poison himself, thinking it was harmless, perhaps under the assumption that it was a soothing drink. The actress merely needs to sit and wait. Maybe she even gave him the cup, he exhaled, a softer death than the law allows. But calculated nonetheless, Gregson exhaled. We'll search for the woman. Holmes shakes his head. You will find nothing. No fingerprints, no name. There's no trace, only a clean cup and a man who discovered too late that someone had changed his final chapter. That evening, Holmes returned to Baker Street and lit his pipe in front of the fire. Watson, she made up a tale for herself, and someone else picked up the pen when the adversary threatened to write her conclusion. You agree? Holmes took a while to respond. I respect the accuracy, the moderation, the phony departure, the substitute passenger, The concealed message in the veil. It was a stage-worthy performance, and fairness. Justice can sometimes take the form of a silent disappearance, Holmes whispered. But let us not forget this was never about vanishing, he said after a lengthy silence. It was about deciding who you want to be when no one else is around. The gaslight threw his figure on the curtain like the final page of a book, silently sealing itself in the darkness as he turned to face the window. Our sitting-room floor was covered in lengthy shadows from the little fire in the fireplace, the clatter of hooves, the distant call of a lamplighter, the faint murmur of discussion from a neighboring corner. All the noises of London continued to reverberate outside. However, the only sounds coming from within 221B were the steady pull of Holmes's pipe and his deep contemplation. Now that the pace had slowed, I too sat in silent contemplation, the events of the previous few days weighing more heavily. After a while, I made the observation, not a question, that she was never in danger. Not taking his eyes off the window, Holmes cocked his head slightly. No, not in the tangible sense. However, emotionally and psychologically, yes. Watson, there are types of incarceration that don't include locks or guards. Emily Harrington was expected to be imprisoned. And the price of her liberty? I applied light pressure. Pritchard has passed away. Her father departed, inquiring as to whether she fled in disgrace or drowned in shame. Holmes returned to his chair after turning away from the window. Yet, Watson, she is still alive. Not as a runaway, but as a mastermind behind her own survival. She would have quietly, honorably, and permanently lost herself if she had followed through on that marriage. She decided to take a chance instead. Deception. Reimagining as I watched him, I added, and perhaps vengeance. Holmes's forehead slightly raised. Vengeance is a sign of passion. This was something colder, I think. Clarity, not cruelty. She recognized the danger, measured it, and eliminated it. You think she ordered Pritchard's death? No. I think she revealed enough to the right person, someone more capable of action, someone who loved her enough to silence a man before he could strike first. Holmes paused, then added, or perhaps the threat spoke for itself. Pritchard may have sensed what was coming and chose his method of departure. I considered this. So you don't intend to pursue it further? What would I pursue? Holmes said softly. No evidence. No witness, no trace. All we have is the whisper of a story, an elegant one, with all its loose ends quietly tied. And yet, I said, rising to refill my cup, so you seem dissatisfied. He watched the flames for a long moment before replying. Only in that I suspect we have not seen the last of Miss Harrington, or whatever name she chooses next. There was a knock at the door. Not Mrs. Hudson's usual gentle tap, but something firmer, more official. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Gregson entered, his face tired, his coat damp from the evening mist. He removed his hat but did not sit. We've concluded the Pritchard inquiry, he said without preamble. The coroner has ruled it suicide. Arsenic in the tea, administered voluntarily. The confession was enough to close the financial fraud investigation, and the mysterious woman in mourning? Holmes asked. Gregson exhaled. Vanished. No name, no trace. No prints, just a faint perfume on the doorknob and a single smudge on the handle of the teacup. Holmes gave a faint smile. A masterful performance. Gregson shook his head. You know as well as I do, Holmes, this wasn't theatre, it was method, deliberate. Someone orchestrated it all to protect that girl. She needed protection, Holmes replied. And someone believed she deserved it. Gregson lingered, his tone shifting slightly. There's more. A letter was delivered to Scotland Yard this morning, addressed to me. No return address. Postmarked York. He handed Holmes the folded paper. I leaned in as Holmes read it aloud. Inspector Gregson, I ask only this. Let sleeping ghosts lie. Edwin Pritchard is gone. The debts are no longer owed. The story is over. If justice was denied in your eyes, I ask you to consider whether the law could ever have granted it. There are some wrongs so subtle, so cloaked in the language of love and propriety, that they can only be undone in silence. Please do not search further. I am not running. I am walking away. V.C. Gregson looked at Holmes. She's asking us to close the book. Holmes folded the letter and handed it back. Then close it, Gregson. She's earned the final chapter. The inspector nodded once, then turned and left as quietly as he'd arrived. The clock on the mantel chimed 7. Holmes did not speak for a while, nor did I. The lamps glowed warmly, casting their golden hues across the walls. At last, Holmes reached for his violin. He tuned it slowly, carefully, then began to play. Not one of his usual fevered adagios, but something softer. Single melancholic melody. It rose and fell like a breath, as though he were translating the unsaid into music. As the notes filled the room, I found myself thinking not of crime or guilt, or even escape, but of a young woman stepping into the unknown, wrapped in grey, eyes clear, spine straight, a woman who had refused to be a possession, a transaction, a bride in lace. Emily Harrington or Violet Clay or Clara, or whatever name she bore now, had not disappeared. She had emerged. Holmes played on, eyes half closed, the bow gliding across the strings. When the last note faded, he opened them and looked at me. "Watson," he said quietly, "sometimes our role is not to arrest the story, but to bear witness to its resolution. And if it unravels again?" He smiled. "Then we begin a new chapter." There was nothing more to say. Outside, the fog began to settle over Baker Street like a curtain drawing shut, and within, all was still, save the soft ticking of the clock and the lingering echo of a melody that neither condemned nor forgave, but simply understood. It was 3 days later when the past came quietly knocking once more. I had just returned to Baker Street from my morning rounds, the air crisp with an early autumn chill, when I found Holmes already deep in thought by the window, a letter held loosely in one hand. The room smelled faintly of burnt tobacco and lavender oil, an odd mixture that made me pause before speaking. "You've had news," I said. Holmes didn't look at me. He merely passed me the letter with a flick of his fingers. It was unsealed, unsigned, and written in an unfamiliar hand, neat, slanted, deliberate. I read it aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you once told me that the veil I left behind was a message. You were correct, but it was also a signal to someone else entirely. There was a watcher at the church that morning, not a friend, not family. He had no name on the guest list, but his presence was unmistakable. A tall man with a limp and a cane of carved ivory. I saw him from the window just before I vanished. He watched the house for 3 days after. He followed Ned. He followed me. Now he follows no one. I believe you should know that. Do not try to find me again, not because I am afraid, but because I am no longer hiding." I lowered the paper slowly, feeling the silence settle between us like dust on a shuttered room. Holmes rose, walking to the fireplace. She was being watched. Before the wedding. During her disappearance, even after she fled. Then it wasn't just Pritchard, I said. There was someone else? He nodded. A third figure, unnamed, unaccounted for. We missed him entirely, Watson, and he knew we would. He stayed out of sight until the others made their move. You believe she's telling the truth? I believe her tone, Holmes replied. It carries no panic, no plea, just certainty. I moved to the desk and unfolded the wedding guest list once more, a page I hadn't glanced at since our early inquiries. Tall man. Ivory cane. Not on the list. Could it have been a private investigator? A creditor? A rival suitor? Holmes shook his head. No, none of those would wait. This man observed, watched her vanish, followed her, but took no action until the others were out of the way. And then he follows no one. I stiffened. You think she's implying he's dead? Or at least, disappeared. There was a long pause before Holmes spoke again. When Pritchard died, I believed the arc had closed, but now I see the final thread was still unspooling. Someone else had an interest in Emily's disappearance, an interest neither familial nor romantic. Someone who waited, perhaps even manipulated events from the periphery. I looked at the letter again. Why would she tell you? Because she wanted me to stop looking, he said. And because she knows I won't. There was a quiet certainty in his voice that unsettled me. Not because I disagreed, but because I recognized the inevitability of it. Holmes would never leave a question half-answered, no matter how delicate the balance of silence someone had tried to preserve. By midday, he had retrieved the records from Scotland Yard, quietly, unofficially. Among the footnotes of the investigation into Pritchard's fraud was a passing mention of a witness, a man seen near Harrington Hall the day before the wedding, loitering on the lane. He had been dismissed at the time as a solicitor's clerk awaiting a client. Tall, thin, pronounced limp. Ivory-headed cane, Holmes read aloud. The detail we missed. Who was he? No identification, Holmes murmured. But the same man was seen outside the boarding house in York 2 days after Emily checked in. She was right, I said. He was following her. Holmes stepped back from the file. We assumed she vanished alone. But what if her escape created a vacuum, and this man stepped in, watching for an opportunity, waiting to collect something left behind, money, documents, blackmail material? Or her, I said. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, or her. But she outpaced him. Hid well, hide smartly. And when she discovered she had a shadow, she decided to make the last move. You mean she... Holmes turned away. She did not include any confirmation details in her letter. But it wasn't just a warning. It was a verdict. She doesn't run anymore, Watson. That remark, he follows no one, is not a boast. It is an epitaph. We returned our gaze to the letter, which had taken on new significance. Later that afternoon, Holmes paid one final visit to an old theatre off Fleet Street. In the dim light of a rehearsal room filled with dusty wigs and faded velvet curtains, he spoke quietly, with the actress we had only known by role until then. She said little, but her expression said it all. When Holmes asked Emily if she had returned to London since the morning of the wedding, she shook her head. When he asked if anyone else, male, tall with a limp, had ever inquired about her, she nodded once. And now? Holmes asked. She met his stare with unwavering eyes. No one comes looking anymore. That evening, Holmes returned to Baker Street and, for the first time in many days, physically and mentally put the case away. The notes, witness statements, and name lists were all slid into a thin, unmarked envelope. He sealed it with wax, no label. No title. I watched him place it in the top drawer of his desk and lock it with a small brass key. You're done? I asked. I am, he answered simply. But the third man, he is gone. We sat silently again, this time pensive rather than heavy. I broke it gently. Holmes, do you think she's safe now? His gaze shifted to the window where dusk had settled over Baker Street like its own veil. Yes, he answered. And more than that, she's free. There was nothing theatrical about his voice. No flourish. Just truth. And in that moment I knew the case of the bride who never took her vows had finally ended, not with arrest, nor trial nor dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, deliberate unraveling of threads until the story no longer bound its characters but let them slip silently into new lives. She had written her own ending, and Holmes, for once, had let her keep it. It was nearly a fortnight after Holmes locked away the file on the Harrington case that the matter returned, not with drama, but with the faintest ripple, just enough to stir the dust of conclusion he had so carefully let settle. I was dining alone at Simpson's when a young woman approached my table. She was plainly dressed, her hat modest, her gloves worn at the fingertips. There was nothing about her to catch the eye, except her composure and the curious familiarity of her gaze. Dr. Watson? She asked softly. I rose instinctively. Yes? She looked about the room as if measuring the risk, then lowered her voice. I believe you knew someone once. A girl who disappeared wearing white, who now wears grey and walks without looking back. I stared. You know her? She sends her thanks, the woman said. And a warning. That single word made the air change around us. What sort of warning? The woman reached into her handbag and produced a small folded sheet of cream paper. She placed it in my hand, glanced over her shoulder and disappeared before I could ask another question. I returned to Baker Street with the note tucked into my coat pocket, uneasy but composed. Holmes was in his armchair, the violin resting across his lap, though he was not playing it. The fire was low, casting flickers of amber against the floorboards. Without a word, I handed him the paper. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, very quietly, he read the contents aloud. Mr. Holmes, a man you thought had vanished has reappeared. The one with the ivory cane is not dead. He merely fell out of sight. He is asking questions again. Not about me, but about you. Whatever game he was playing, it was never about the girl. It was always about who would follow the wrong trail first. You were meant to find her. And to believe it was the end, it isn't. Be careful with what you left unfinished. V. Holmes read the note again, this time to himself, then leaned back slowly in the chair. So, he murmured, the ghost returns. You believe her? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. I do, but why now? Why resurface at all? Holmes tapped the paper lightly. Because this was never about the bride. It was about the net around her. Pritchard was the most visible knot, but not the only one. We assumed the Ivory Cane Man was a blackmailer, a scavenger hoping to profit from chaos. But if V is correct, he was something else entirely. I felt my stomach tighten. What could he possibly want from you? Holmes's gaze narrowed slightly, not in alarm but in assessment. It is a rare thing, Watson, when one realizes he has been cast in someone else's narrative, without ever knowing the script. You think someone used the Harrington affair to manipulate you? Not just me, all of us. Pritchard, Emily, even Gregson. The man with the cane, he never intervened. He watched, calculated, waited. His silence was not hesitation, it was design. I turned to pace near the fireplace. What do we do now? We observe, Holmes said. For now we do nothing. I turned sharply. Nothing? He stood, unfolding himself like a statue returning to motion. When a spider returns to its web, it does so to check the damage, not to spin again immediately. If he is showing himself, it is because he believes something has shifted, that someone has made a move. You mean Emily? Or someone else? We are no longer dealing with a crime of passion or desperation. We are facing a longer game, one that may have begun before the bride ever vanished. He reached into the drawer where he had locked the case file and retrieved it silently. For a long while we said nothing as he reviewed each page, names, timelines, sightings, photographs, old telegrams. He handled it all with reverence, as though assembling the edges of a map he had only half understood before. Then he paused. This, he said. It was a receipt, an innocuous line from the hotel in York. One guest, 2 carpetbags, breakfast for one. I dismissed it, Holmes murmured, because I assumed the second bag was hers packed in London. But she travelled light. She told us that. Which means... He trailed off and turned sharply to the window. She wasn't alone when she arrived in York. I moved beside him. But we saw no trace of a second person. Exactly. Which means they were never intended to be seen. He turned abruptly and rang for Mrs. Hudson. Please fetch my directory. I'll need the number for the Midland Hotel in York. 20 minutes later, we had the hotel manager himself on the wire. Holmes inquired casually at first, then with increasing precision. Yes, he answered. June 14th, booked under Miss Violet Clay, 2 carpetbags. Occupied the upper north room. Yes, and you're certain no other name was associated with the reservation? A pause, I see. A second key was issued. No, I don't require the name. Thank you. He hung up slowly, then looked at me. Someone traveled with her, he replied. Not that actress. Not Ned, someone else. The man with the cane. Possibly. Or someone close to him. Regardless, she trusted them, or was forced to accept them. The air had shifted again. What appeared to be a finished tapestry had begun to unravel, not in the middle, but along the edges, where frayed strands went unnoticed until they began to rip away of the weave. That night, Holmes didn't sleep. He sat with the package open across his knees, stitching the whole thing back together, not as a completed case, but as a prelude to something bigger. I remained vigilant nearby, my journal unread and the lamp burning low. She chose to vanish, I finally said. But someone decided to watch, and now he is observing us. Holmes nodded without looking up. Because whatever he is, he thinks the game is incomplete. And now so do I. As a result, the calm story of the disappeared bride, which had previously appeared to be resolved in veils and silences, took on a deeper and stranger dimension. One puzzle layered inside another. A curtain fell only to expose another stage. Holmes reclined back as daylight broke through the corners of the room, and the fog outside began to clear. Watson, he replied gently, we were not wrong in closing the case, but we were mistaken to expect that it would remain closed. And somewhere beyond London's waking streets, the man with the ivory cane, no longer a shadow, waited for his next move. Nearly a month later, in the fading light of an October afternoon, the final piece of the puzzle dropped calmly into place, not with a thunderclap, but with a delicate knock on the door. Holmes and I have talked little about the Harrington case since that final note. The man with the ivory cane departed as quickly as he reappeared, leaving only silence. And Holmes, while not idle, had pushed the issue to the back of his mind, as he did with enigmas that had yet to reveal their entire pattern. But that day, The knock came softly and deliberately. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a silver tray. Holmes accepted it and read the name without reaction. "Captain Elias Tournier," he announced gently. "Do you know him?" I asked. He did not respond directly. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who came was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the worn-out grace of a soldier who had seen too much and become accustomed to carrying it. His eyes were pale and vigilant, as if he were watching out of habit rather than fear. He walked with a limp, holding an ivory and jet cane in his left hand. He took off his hat, nodded to Holmes, then to me. "Hi, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. I will not take up much of your time. I've come to make a confession, not of crime but of design." Holmes motioned to the chair across from him. "Then let's begin with the part where you watched a young woman vanish from her home, tracked her across counties, and disappeared just as quietly." Tournier grinned slightly. "You witnessed more than most." But not all. Holmes didn't speak. He simply waited. Tournier sat with the cane across his lap. "I never pursued Miss Harrington. Not directly. I was chasing the men who surrounded her. Pritchard, undoubtedly, but also the brokers behind him. She was the bait, not the prize." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "So your intelligence," was it, Tournier answered. "Naval office. Quiet operation. Foreign entanglements, forgeries, and fraud. I had grounds to assume Pritchard's finances were being utilized to launder debts from a much broader operation. If left uncontrolled, this type of activity has the potential to change shares in European trade. But in order to establish it, I had to let him play his hand. And I needed to know if Emily Harrington was complicit in the deceit or if she was simply caught up in it." Holmes sat back and curled his fingers. "So you watched?" "You waited. I had to. If I intervened too soon, he would assume another identity. He had a half-dozen people waiting. But the girl did something I didn't expect. She disappeared first, and that disrupted your strategy. It accomplished more than that. It set fire to the net I had cast. Everyone scattered, and I had to make a decision. Protect the girl or continue the pursuit." Holmes inclined his head. "So you followed her?" Tournier nodded. "She was clever. Changed names. I left false trails. But more significantly, she knew she was being observed. And she made a decision." He looked up at both of us. She turned to confront me. "In York, not in dread, but in tranquility. She said, 'If you want to know the truth, I'll tell you, but not to be used again. I'm not here to help you punish him, only to ensure that it ends.'" The stillness was thick with unspoken words. Holmes replied, "You gave her the second key." Tournier gave a slight nod. I remained in the room next door. We made it appear as though she was traveling alone. I assisted her in boarding a decoy under another name. She needed to disappear. I needed to make sure she wasn't swallowed by the web I was trying to dismantle. "And Pritchard?" I inquired. "Did you kill him?" "No," he replied evenly. "That was her story to conclude, not mine. But I made certain that the people who funded him saw it. And once they did, the money stopped flowing." Holmes offered a slow nod. "You used her disappearance to shutter a network." "And she used me," Tournier said, not unkindly, "to become free. There was nothing more theatrical about it. No villains dragged to trial. No gunshots in the dark. Only the knowledge that two threads, hers and his, had briefly intersected, each saving the other in their own way." Tournier rose, his cane clicking softly on the floor. "I came to thank you," he said. "You followed a trail meant to distract, and still found the truth beneath it. That is rare." Holmes stood as well. "And you?" "I'm finished," Tournier said. "The others will disappear now. They always do when the light turns their way." He turned to go, then paused. "She's alive, you know. Not in the legal sense. Not in any court's registry. But in her own way, more than ever before." And then he was gone. Holmes stood at the window a long while after. "You knew," I said eventually, "that someone else had been pulling strings." "I suspected," Holmes replied, "but I let it lie. Because for once, Watson, the game was not ours to win." He turned from the window, a glimmer of something almost like peace in his face. "Do you remember what she wrote? I am not running. I am walking away." She did not ask for justice. She chose resolution. "And him? A soldier who traded weapons for shadows," Holmes murmured. "Who did what he could while he could. There was nothing more to uncover. That night, as Holmes played the violin softly in the gloom, I realized that not every mystery is meant to be unraveled completely. Some are meant to be understood just enough, to grant peace, not punishment. The case of the bride who never took her vows would never make the papers. No arrests, no trial, no formal ending. But in a quiet corner of the world, a woman who had once stood at the edge of obligation now walked freely beneath another name. And behind her, a man with an ivory cane faded back into mist, leaving only silence and the faintest mark of grace. And Holmes, with all his brilliance and detachment, had done something rare. He had let the curtain fall without pulling it back.